Hi everyone, how's it going? Welcome to our nation's capital, where everyone is working towards a common goal. Well, I'm hearing some smiles and laughs out there. You guys don't believe me, huh? Well, we'll just have to agree to disagree, I guess. I'm Stephen Cox. I'm VP and Chief Security Architect at SecureAuth. When my PR lead and I were sort of throwing out ideas for talks at Identiverse, he came up with this, and I'm a big history buff, so it was kind of exciting for me to do this because I like to talk about history and stuff. But I won't. Don't worry. I'm not going to bore you with a bunch of slides on the history of American prohibition and speakeasies in the United States. But as I was doing my research, I came across this really funny video. This is a Groucho Marx video. It's from a movie called Horse Feathers that was made in 1932. And before I continue, I just want to go ahead and kick this off so you guys can hear it. So let's make sure that we have audio on this.
Hey, Baravelli.
What do you want?
Watch the door for a few minutes, and don't let anyone in without the password.
All right, what is it?
Swordfish is the password, do you understand?
Okay, I got it.
Well, what is it?
Password.
Swordfish! Swordfish!
Right, the swordfish, the swordfish. Piazza muscolo in the room full of faccia di pazzi. Who are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Who are you?
I'm fine too, but you can't come in unless you give the password.
Oh, what is the password?
Oh, no, you gotta tell me. Hey, I tell what I do, I give you 3 guesses. It's the name of a fish.
Is it Mary?
That's no fish.
She isn't. Well, she drinks like one. Let me see. Is it sturgeon?
Hey, you crazy. Sturgeon, he's a doctor who cuts you open when you're sick. Now, I give you one more chance.
I got it. Haddock.
That's the funny. I got a headache too.
What do you take for a haddock?
Well, now sometimes I take aspirin, or sometimes I take a calomel.
Say, I'd walk a mile for a calomel.
You mean chocolate calomel? I like that too, but guess it. Hey, what's the matter? You don't understand English? You can't come in here unless you say swordfish. Now, I give you one more guess.
Swordfish. Swordfish. I think I got it. Is it swordfish?
That's it. You guess it.
Pretty good, huh?
Fine. You guess it.
What do you want?
I want to come in.
What's the password?
No, you're no fool of me. Swordfish.
No, I got tired of that. I changed it.
What's the password now?
Yeah, I forgot it. I better come outside with you.
So I really found this hilarious, and it's really amazing to me that this was made in a 1932 movie, right? It's going on 90 years ago, so it covers a lot of the challenges that we have with passwords today, and it's kind of what I wanted to focus on in the beginning of my presentation here. If you recognize Swordfish, it was actually the title of a really terrible movie made in the early 2000s. Had Hugh Jackman in it, who played I think a hacker for hire, and so that the name of that movie is actually directly attributable to this particular scene, which I thought was interesting to read. So a little bit about me. I've been in the identity space about 4.5 years, I guess, as Chief Security Architect of SecureAuth. I spent a couple of years before that working for Mandiant and then FireEye when they were acquired, doing endpoint forensics and threat detection. And then before that, I worked at a company called NetWitness that was acquired by RSA, who did network forensics and threat detection. So I've been kind of different parts of security, very focused on how to detect and defend against threats. The picture up there is me testing for my first dan in Taekwondo this past May. Board breaking is one of the things you have to do to test. So that's me doing a flying sidekick over pads. My son, my 10-year-old son, also tested with me so we were able to test together, which was really cool. I started it when I was about 38 years old. I'm 41 now, and I'm probably in the best shape of my life, which is kind of amazing. I've been kind of in better shape than I was in my 20s. So it's been a great thing for me and my family. So let's jump in here. The first lesson that you can kind of take from that video is that kind of an understatement, but passwords are and have long been insecure, right? Groucho's able to, sort of brute force his way into that speakeasy in a relatively short amount of time, right? It is a little bit of a spoof, a little bit of a goofy movie, but comedy often echoes reality, and they were sort of making fun of, the common way that speakeasies were entered by patrons in this era. We know today, of course, that passwords are a huge issue, still insecure, not a great solution for authentication. But it's just amazing to me again that this movie was made almost 90 years ago, and we're talking about some of the same topics in a different context, which is kind of interesting. Second lesson, passwords are easily forgotten. So you saw the interplay between the speakeasy proprietor and the doorman, right? Trying to tell him the password. What's the password? No, it's password. No, swordfish, right? So they got frustrated with each other, and sort of it was easily forgotten. And then of course later in the scene, Groucho himself forgets the password and it changes the password, and they both forget it, right? And then they sort of can't get back into the speakeasy, right? So this is a challenge that we have today as well. Passwords are often forgotten by the users, which results in sort of IT calls, and it's sort of a challenge that we face with a something factor that you have to use. Lesson 3, passwords are easily stolen. So the password, again, it's a goofy scene, but the password is sort of stolen by Groucho in relatively short amount of time, right? And he's able to use it to get into the speakeasy. So we know this is a huge problem today, right? There's literally billions of passwords available on the dark web, and more and more are stolen every day. So this is still a challenge that we're fighting 90 years later. And passwords are just frustrating, right? It's just not a great user experience. Users have to remember complex passwords, or they have to sort of use a password manager. They're always forgetting their passwords, like we said. It's frustration for the IT departments because there's always password reset type things going on. So this is just not a great solution in terms of security and UX. So that's something to keep in mind as well with the current solution of passwords. So let's fast forward to the 60s. This gentleman here is Professor Fernando Corbato. Sorry for the grammar mistake on the slide there, but Professor Corbato was a researcher and professor at MIT, and he worked on a project called CTSS, which was a time-sharing system, operating systems type of project where that sort of was very influential in the development of modern operating systems. One of the things that he needed for his solution, for his project, was a way to distinguish users so that they could be placed into their own sort of workspace within the system and have their own set of private files. So he came up with the idea of a token that a user would enter from their terminal, and then they'd be sort of placed in their own location. So this is largely considered by the information security the first use of a password in a computing context. So there is some controversy around it, but you can argue that Fernando Corbato was very influential in the development of using a password in a computing context. So Professor Corbato is still kicking. He's in his 90s. He did an interview with the Wall Street Journal in 2014 or 15, I think, and he was quoted as saying that the password has become kind of a nightmare, right? Interesting talking point. Sort of the creator of something turning on their creation, right? And a bit of an understatement. So here we are today in 2019. It's been very interesting for me, having been in the space a couple of years and sort of keeping my finger on the pulse of the media and industry reports. There's definitely been an uptick in media coverage of identity security in the first parts of 2019. You're seeing a lot of discussions around, the end of the password and, is 2FA broken? Are there ways to bypass simple 2FA? and then some discussions of sort of open source tools that are coming out and making it easier for people to phish, easier for attackers to phish users. The Verizon DBIR, which comes out every year, the Mandiant M-Trends report, which comes out every year, they're always talking about how identity is increasingly being attacked, and that weak and stolen credentials are often involved in sort of these major breaches that they're covering. So this has been very encouraging to me as a person that's been in identity for a number of years. I'm kind of encouraged by the increased coverage, and it's great to just be able to have conversations about it out in the public. So let's take a deeper look at some of the statistics that I mentioned. So we're spending a lot of money on information security, right? Over $100 billion spent across network, endpoint, and identity. And we're still seeing breaches increase, right? In 2018, it was reported that breaches increased by 44%. So we're still not quite getting it right, and we're still missing something. We're still not sort of attacking some of the low-hanging fruit that's out there. And as I mentioned, sort of the DBIR, they reported in 2017 that 81% of breaches involved stolen or weak credentials, which is just a massive number, right? The DBIR has kind of changed its format a little bit in the 2018 model, but they still are talking very much about identity-related issues being at the forefront of breaches. They also talked about in the 2017 report that 40% of systems still use the password, whereas 2FA was only sort of covering 60% of the systems that they audited. So. We're still playing a little bit of game of catch up in where we're deploying our 2FA solutions. Here's a statistic I thought was really interesting that we collected. 4 out of 5 adults reuse passwords. So we've all been guilty of this. And I don't. If you're thinking right now that I tweak my passwords between multiple websites, you don't get a pass on that, because attackers are actually becoming wise to that. And their tools that they use for sort of credential stuffing, which I'll talk about, can actually take advantage of common tweaking algorithms. So they're getting very effective at even taking out users that are tweaking their passwords between sites. Users also pick very poor passwords. So you'll see these funny top password lists that come out every year. The most common ones are always like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or password, or baseball, right? Or very simple words. These passwords are easily brute forced. Additional problem, as I mentioned, there's literally billions of passwords available on the dark web. In some cases, even on the surface web, if you can go to like BitTorrent sites, you can often get caches of passwords to use in your nefarious deeds. The reuse problem is huge in that case, and it really kind of speaks to the fact that the sins of our past can kind of come back to haunt us in the future. And like I said, I have a slide on credential stuffing in a little bit that I'll talk through. So in a survey that we did, 99% of the participants said that they thought two-factor authentication would address a lot of the recent data breach concerns. And sort of prevent people from unauthorized access. I think the optimism's really good. We have learned that attackers can increasingly bypass simple forms of 2FA in certain circumstances. So relying solely on 2FA as the solution isn't good security policy. We can do better. The average U.S. breach is costing about $8 million. Of course, the Target and Home Depot breaches were up over $100 million. So the cost of breaches is sort of rising. And something that I thought was interesting is that we're getting a lot of inbound discussions from customers and prospects that user experience is important to them. So they've had sort of failed 2FA deployments. They're having issues with user adoption, and a lot of that has to do with the user experience, right? It's the users don't like to be interrupted all the time to be able to get to the resources they want to get to. So what's really fascinating right now is we're also in this period of sort of unprecedented challenges in our infrastructure that we're, that as we build out to the cloud. So we're experiencing what we call identity sprawl. It happens really fast, right? So as these companies start to expand out into the cloud, They're moving their business processes out to the cloud. They're building consumer portals. With that comes a very difficult balancing act of managing the associated identities, right? And as these deployments proliferate, your data stores proliferate, and you're just managing many more identities than you were in the past. One challenge that we hear a lot from customers and prospects is that they're often having to deploy multiple solutions to complete coverage. So they may have to deploy multiple solutions to cover the sort of on-prem case and the cloud case, and that's just a big challenge for them. So it really kind of speaks to the need to centralize identity and be able to handle those hybrid environments. Customers are telling us that the password is no longer acceptable. This isn't me out here talking about the passwordless future in sort of a thought leadership type of role. This is something that customers are talking to us about, prospects are talking to us about. They want to get rid of these password databases. They want to move past the password. This is something we're having discussions actively with customers and prospects. And then there's the question of, well, what does lie beyond 2FA? It's a great start. As I mentioned, attackers are increasingly bypassing very simple 2FA methods. So we need to think about how do we get past just the basic 2FA methods. So I really want to emphasize this point about digital transformation. I know it's a bit of a buzzword. If you walk around the expo, if you walked around some of the other major conferences this year, you're seeing a lot of people talk about digital transformation. But buzzwords are often rooted in reality, and this is something that's happening and happening fast. If you don't believe me, go look at the revenues of some of the major cloud providers over the last 2 years. And it really speaks to, we are moving to the cloud, and we're moving to the cloud fast, right? We do have to be cognizant that organizations today will be a hybrid of on-premise and cloud infrastructure, and maybe for a long time, right? And there may be pullback from the cloud eventually, right? So we really have to recognize the fact that we need to be able to handle the hybrid situation with our identity solutions. And it really speaks to identity really being the thing that binds everything together in this sort of modern IT infrastructure that we have. So as we're moving to the cloud, our infrastructure, our business processes are moving to the cloud. The threats are evolving as well. I mentioned credential stuffing. This is a challenge that we are definitely seeing increasing among our customers and prospects, and it's something that we're having a lot of conversations about right now, and something that we're seeing definitely grow. I know we always talk about how attackers evolve, but it's very much the truth right now. We're seeing their methodology become more sophisticated. We're in a period where they have sort of easy access to extremely powerful tools on the open source community, and they've become smarter about collecting and weaponizing data from social media. So if you want to actively easily phish somebody, you sort of collect information about them on social media and then use that against them during a phishing attack. We're also seeing that 2FA is increasingly being bypassed. This isn't something that we're predicting. It's something that we're seeing, right? And there's a number of ways that this can happen. I don't want to spend too much time, talking through a lot of them, but you might have heard things like like SIM swap frauds in the recent news, where an attacker will contact your phone company and try to have your account transferred over to a new phone, new SIM card, in which case they have sort of complete access over your, over very simple forms of 2FA like SMS. They can sort of intercept your messages. There's been some historical challenges with the SS7 protocol, which is used with modern phones, where attackers were able to sort of glitch it into intercepting text and calls. We're seeing increasing cases of malware being landed on phones, where they sort of can sniff anything that's coming by. So there are ways to bypass 2FA. There are some pretty high-profile breaches that have happened in recent years around bypassing simple 2FA methods. So credential stuffing. Let's talk about that a little bit. I kind of talk about this in the context of paying for our mistakes, right? We've spent decades building these gigantic databases of passwords. They're available. A lot of them are available on the dark web. Attackers have sort of easy access to them. And with credential stuffing, an attacker will obtain a cache of stolen credentials. They'll plug it into their attack tools, and then they'll sort of train it on a website or a set of websites, and they'll keep trying those credentials until they work, right? You'll see this a lot with consumer portal style websites, rewards type sites like that. We've seen some news about that in recent months. And it's interesting because we've had prospects engage with us purely on the fact that they're having challenges with this type of attack, with this type of credential stuffing attack. And it may not even be that accounts are being breached. It may just be it's become a massive nuisance because they've built these portals that have password lockout capabilities to where if sort of an account is accessed a certain number of times over a certain period of time, the account gets locked out and the user has to either contact IT or change their password. So this is a massive headache for organizations right now, and it's continuing to grow. It relies on that penchant of users to share passwords between websites, right? So. And as I mentioned, we were talking about tweaking, and the attackers have developed algorithms to tweak those commonly used passwords, like changing an A to an @ symbol, or changing a 1 into a 2. All the sort of common tweaking methods that we've all used in our history. Even the chief security architect of SecureAuth. Another throwback to a long existing attack. These attacks are often highly distributed, the old DDoS attacks. Well, DDoS attacks are coming back as well. But an attacker will build an army of bots, or they'll simply lease or rent space on an existing botnet to undertake these attacks. So it becomes very difficult for organizations to defend them purely at a network level, right? You can't just ban an IP address, block an IP address. These are very distributed attacks. So. Combined with the fact that we have these hybrid organizations where we may have, infrastructure spread across various locations, cloud and on-prem, it really, and across maybe a variety of federation techniques, it really speaks to the need to, again, centralize identity and have help from the identity layer in terms of combating credential stuffing. But yeah, it's definitely something that customers and prospects are talking to us about right now, and something you need to consider when you're expanding yourself out into the cloud. So how do we start thinking about going passwordless? How do we design a solution that doesn't weaken the overall model? We have to keep that in mind. We have to be cognizant that we're not just sort of eliminating a password and moving completely to just a device as the login method, right? If you're familiar with the old adage, and I know all of you are, being identity pros, sort of something something you have, something you are. What we are proposing is that you shift from something you know to something you are. So you would, instead of entering a password, something doing a push to accept a second factor with something you have, a device, you would do a biometric authentication on a device. So you would effectively be moving from something something you have, to something you have, something you are. There's a lot of interesting aspects to this type of authentication that you may not have considered. One interesting architectural aspect to this type of solution is that biometric profiles often don't have to leave the device. So When you authenticate to your smartphone, your profile lives on that phone. As opposed to the challenge of a password where there's this sort of centralized credential database. So if an attacker was going to breach a large number of users within an organization, they're going to have to sort of get to all of the phones of those or devices of those users rather than just sort of grabbing this sort of central credential database. So there's a very good architectural benefit to moving towards a biometric solution for passwordless. One of the things we have to consider with this is that we can't just we don't want to just stop at moving from sort of one factor to another, right? Moving from something to something you are. You want to really think about making risk analysis the norm. So when we do our authentications, when we are authenticating users, we are analyzing them actively for risk as they log in. And I have a whole slide on risk analysis, but I want to make sure that this point gets across that risk analysis really has to become the norm with any passwordless solution that you undertake. So how do we enact passwordless in practice? So let's just walk you through a quick example. This would be like a web login to a consumer portal. So the user would come along, they would enter their credentials, they would be run through a risk analysis engine, and the risk analysis engine would pull out whatever attributes that it can from the authentication transaction and run it through, run it through its layers. One of the great things is that there's sort of no action required by the user during this risk analysis step. All of this is being done behind the scenes. And like I said, I have a slide on this so I can talk through sort of what all the different 15 layers that we recommend. I can talk through that a little bit. The next step is that we would dispatch a signal to your device. It'd probably be in the form of a push to accept or symbol to accept, which is a different type of push to accept that we offer at SecureAuth. Once you sort of opened your device, brought up the app, based on the notification, you'd be asked to enter your biometric. So, on an Android device, you might use your fingerprint. On an iPhone, you may use your face. And sort of the consumer phone market is leading the charge here. Once you successfully entered your biometric, you would be passed on to your resource. So this would be a very secure login without using a password.
What is TOTP?
A time-based OTP. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about risk analysis. Do a little deep dive on risk analysis and identity security. A risk analysis engine would want to look at kind of whatever it can pull from the transaction, across maybe the IP addresses, the device aspects, the location. But let me run through each of these and give you sort of just a high level. We'd first look at the device to see if we have recognized that device in the past. So whatever attributes we can pull from the device, maybe via the browser. We would sort of determine if it looks like the device the user last successfully logged in with, right? And if it's different or significantly different, we would raise the risk profile of that user. We would look at the location that the request is coming from. Maybe it's coming from a place that you don't have users, within your environment. Maybe it's coming from a risky part of the world that you want to sort of call out. That's something that you could do with an adaptive authentication engine and risk analysis. You'd look at whether an improbable travel event had occurred. So if I've logged in from San Francisco and then an hour later I'm logging in from Washington, D.C., obviously I can't travel that distance in that short amount of time, so that's going to raise the risk profile of this user. You would look at the group membership to determine if this user is trying to access something that they shouldn't be. And you can also look at sort of the state of the attributes within the user profile. So does this profile look like a profile that was created by your IT department? You could set up rules around this. So if it looks like it wasn't created by your IT department, sort of what fields have been populated, it might be a sign of an attacker creating their own credentials after they've, sort of breached your environment. So something that could, sort of slightly raise the risk profile. You could check the IP address of the transaction against your own sort of white and black list. So is it coming from a a known whitelisted IP address? Is it coming from a corporate IP range that you recognize, or some other IP addresses that you specify? Is it on a blacklist, meaning that you have actively seen this IP address before in some malicious activity, right? And you wanted to make sure that you detect it in the future. Is the request coming from an anonymity network, or sort of otherwise trying to hide its IP? Is it using is it coming from a Tor node? Is it coming from an anonymizing proxy, right? So there's a certain amount of risk that you should associate with a user that's trying to hide their source IP address. Maybe that's something you even block via policy within your environment. You would want to think about absorbing third-party risk scores in the authentication process. So if you have a UEBA solution, something like a user entity behavior analytics solution, if you have an IGA solution, or sort of any solution that provides risk information specific to a user, that's something that fits very well into an adaptive authentication risk analysis. So you may want to consider it while you're authenticating users. You can look at the phone number, which is interesting. So you may want to look at the phone number and block requests from unknown phone carriers. So you can sort of look up the phone carrier for that phone number and make some decisions based on that. You might want to know if it's coming from a VoIP phone versus a landline. So attackers often use VoIP phones. That's something that you can factor into your risk profile. You also want to look to see if it's been recently ported. So this is a way that you can help defend against these SIM swap scams that we're seeing a lot out in the field. So these are all things that around the phone number that you can use to sort of up the risk profile. You can certainly check the IPs against real-time threat intelligence feeds. There's a number of great companies out there that provide intelligence around attacker activity. Some are even very specific to the authentication use case. So there's some good information you can get there. And then lastly, you can use the user's access history as a way to sort of identify abnormal user behavior. So like for me, I log in at 9 in the morning, I access my mail. I then sort of pivot over to the source control repository to see what code's been pushed in the last day. My account is all of a sudden seen on a Sunday morning at 2 a.m. accessing all the file shares within the environment, and that's abnormal user behavior for me, and that's something that could signal attacker presence or raise the risk profile of the total authentication. So I want to talk a little bit about machine learning in the identity security context. I know ML is also sort of reaching buzzword status. You're going to see it a lot if you're walking around the expo and walking around some of the other major conferences out there this year. We're not going to be. It's not going to solve all our problems, right? We're not going to be Homer Simpson sort of sitting there while the little water bird hits the enter key. But the truth is, it's an extremely valuable tool, extremely powerful tool that has a lot of good use cases. One of the major use cases that we've identified for ML that's valid in security is around user behavior, right? That's a valid and it's a very proven use case. And if you've ever had your credit card denied because you're on vacation and you're buying something that you normally don't, you have been subjected to user behavior analytics, right? This is something that the financial institutions have been using for a long time, and it's starting to find its way into identity security. So one of the great things about this type of technology is that it fits perfectly into adaptive authentication, right? It is an identifier of risk with a user, so it is something that you can fit into your adaptive authentication methodology and ultimately your passwordless solutions. So what you're really going to get, from all of this is, ultimately better breach protection, right? So you're at the bottom line, you're knowing more about the identities that are accessing your systems. The more characteristics that you're analyzing, the more clear you're going to be whether that user is actually who they say they are. Each of those aspects that you're looking at, each of those characteristics that you're evaluating is conceptually another layer of security. So it's kind of going along the argument of defense in depth. So it's going to be really difficult for an attacker to get past all of those. If you don't look, you're not going to find, right? So if you're not analyzing things like device, location, IP address, and the behavior of the user, you're really rarely going to ever find anything. So you're going to be, that confidence and that trust is going to be higher, and you're going to be more likely to be able to remove authentication disruptions for those users. So some things to think about. You could automate some various workflows here. So if you had a user with very low risk, you could sort of remove, maybe you remove the 2FA step altogether and you just give them immediate access, if they're sort of accessing a low risk resource within your environment. If they sort of have some risk, but not much, maybe you sort of require the 2FA step, right? You force them through a 2FA step. For users that the risk is very high, you could sort of maybe redirect them to a honeypot where you could watch them more closely. If you are using a password, maybe you could force a password reset, but we would be doing this in a passwordless context. For users with extremely high risk, you could deny them access altogether, right? You could certainly just deny them access and then notify your SOC that something has happened with that user. And you would make all these decisions as an administrator of your adaptive authentication solution. So this would be policy that you would set up within your passwordless solution. So I wanted to leave you with this quote. This quote was given to me, was shared with me by our former director of UX at SecureAuth. Jared Spool is a gentleman that's very well known in the UX and design space. He often talks about the intersection of security and UX. And the quote I thought was really interesting. If it's not usable, it's not secure, right? It's kind of a simple quote, but it has a lot of meaning. So if you put unusable systems in front of users, they're going to find ways around it. They're going to find ways to weaken it. Passwords are a good example as being an unusable system because users are trying to weaken it by sort of using weak passwords or tweaking passwords. Right? They're sort of gaming the rules to get around it. It also sort of leads to the shadow IT problem. Where I can't log into my file sharing system for some reason. So I'm just going to set up a new Dropbox account and go outside the norms of my normal IT infrastructure. So that is something that we see a lot. But I thought I'd leave you with this quote because I thought it was really meaningful. And it looks like I've got about 10 minutes for questions. So ask away. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's largely threat intelligence based. We, if you wanted to know sort of it's coming from a Tor node, Tor actually publishes the exit node IPs. So as you're sort of scanning over the IP address, you can sort of check it against the Tor list. There's a number of IP intelligence providers out there that will actually tell you things like, is this a proxy? Or is this a bot? And sort of the level of the proxy. Is it sort of a simple, repeating proxy? Is it an anonymizing proxy? It is a Tor node, so it'll kind of give you the levels of how effective of an anonymizing proxy it is. So that's typically something we pull from intelligence. Sir.
How do you do reliable device identification in the web?
On the web, yeah. So we that's a field that's sort of ever evolving, but we will pull a number of attributes from the browser, whatever we can pull from the browser to sort of create a fingerprint of the device in the web context. So it's something that we have to be constantly iterating upon because the browsers don't want to be identified. So it's something that we're sort of constantly iterating on over the years. And I think we can. I think we might have some information on device fingerprinting on our website if you wanted to look more in depth on it. Yes, sir.
So short of blocking white devices, what are your thoughts on managing that risk?
On blocking what?
White,
Wait, yeah. So what?
thoughts on, you're short of blocking them altogether. What are your thoughts on managing that risk?
I mean, you certainly can't just block it based on the fact that it's VoIP, but it's something that we would sort of factor into the overall risk profile of that user, right? So if it's sort of something that they're coming in from a VoIP phone that's been recently ported, that's coming in from a risky part of the world, that might up my risk profile enough to where I'm always gonna put people in front of them. I may consider blocking them altogether. I'm certainly going to notify my security operations center that gives some telemetry to my security operations center that this type of risky transaction is happening, within the environment. Sir.
How does credential compromise recovery change when you detect that the jig's up?
So credential compromise recovery. So like in the case of a passwordless context.
So if your risk analysis shows that you think that the device or the biometrics have been compromised, how do you allow the original user to recover the account?
Yeah, I mean that would be up to the organization. I mean it would probably be an IT conversation, at that point. If it's a company-owned phone, maybe we issue a new phone. If it's an end user's phone, then it's a conversation with the user about how we sort of generate new credentials for that user.
You see AI and the bots adding new threats to the world, and do you see that? How do we handle that?
So do I see?
At the advent of the new innovations coming in AI and bots, would that pose any threats to our identity?
Yeah, I mean, sort of the whole botnet problem is something that we're definitely seeing amongst our user base. The challenge around AI-driven botnets, maybe trying to get around being detected in some way is definitely something that we see. We've been working on some concepts around sort of dynamic IP blocking, to where if a user if credentials are logging in and they sort of meet certain basic patterns, we will sort of back them off for a period of time. Or maybe block them altogether for a period of time. So it's something that we're sort of designing intelligence into our cloud about looking for these types of patterns that form for users. Yes, sir.
What are your thoughts around passwordless authentication for applications and services? Many of them still use passwords for auth. They don't really have a biometric that they can use. Do you see any innovations or advancements in the field?
So you're talking about like a more like an Yeah. So I mean, I think in those cases where a biometric isn't available, we would still recommend sort of a strong second factor on top of a password with risk analysis on top of it, because that's still a pretty strong way to authenticate if you must use a password, right, where you don't have the option to use a biometric. Now, the interesting thing about the web workflow that I showed there is that the biometric lives on your device. It's something you provision on your device. So if you're accessing a portal via the API, if you're using sort of an API-driven approach, like using our product as an API behind your consumer portal, you could still use a biometric on the device because it's not sort of on the side of the portal, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I was kind of asking more like app-to-app type of thing where there isn't a user.
Oh, yeah. I don't know. We haven't really delved into that area too much. We've been focused on sort of workforce authentication. So, okay. Thank you very much, everyone.